everyone, and welcome to another episode of Break into Law School. I'm the guest host, LoVetta Jenkins. Today, I'm joined by CJ Donald. CJ Donald is a graduate of Centre College and Vanderbilt University Law School. He is currently a senior associate at Hayes and Boone LLP, where he focuses on financial transactions and sports law. So, of course, we have got a lot to learn. Welcome, CJ.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be with you today.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. So, I got to ask you some questions. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what exactly is like sports law or the transactions you do.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I kind of always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. Not sure where that came from, to be honest, but of course, in my city, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and a lot of the big players in politics and business were lawyers on the state and the local level. And so I decided at a really young age, I wanted to focus on the law. So even throughout my time in undergrad, I never wavered. I majored in political science, and then I went right to Vanderbilt Law School. I'm in law school, kind of focused on what kind of lawyer do I want to be? Because I think a lot of people get to law school and they don't really think about that aspect. They, kind of look at TV, they look at Suits, or they look at Lincoln Lawyer or whatever MASH of a certain age. And you kind of think, well, that's what a lawyer does, right? But there's so much else out there. And after I got out of law school, actually, is when I learned about how much business law and how many opportunities there were for young lawyers in that sector. So, as a finance lawyer, what I do is I represent banks in commercial loan transactions with big commercial borrowers. So, think any big company, when they get ready to ask the bank for money, there are lawyers on both sides, right? And those deals are usually in the million, sometimes $1 billion level. And that's what my firm really specializes in our practice group. On the sports law side, you'll hear a lot of people say there's no such thing as sports law, right? Because sports companies, entertainment companies really are just businesses. And so it's probably more apt to say that these are business law things kind of in the sports industry, but of course, everyone abbreviates it as sports law. So within sports law, I really focus on commercial contracts between sports teams and vendors and sponsorship agreements. I also do a lot of commercial loan transactions between banks and sports teams.
So, when you say that you handle a lot of things with vendors and, things of that nature, are you the guy responsible for the big named drink at certain places where teams are?
Exactly right. So that will be an example of a sponsorship agreement, right? So there's business team at the team level and a business team at the vendor level that come together and say, hey, we have an opportunity here to create some joint product, right? If you think about anything, you go to an event, an arena, and you see this is the official drink of this arena, or this is the official, wireless provider of this arena. There's a team at the sports level that says, hey, we can get money by getting a sponsor for this function, right? And once that sales team finds that deal, then it's on legal to really, kind of nail that deal down and make sure it works for all parties. The teams are very sophisticated, so a lot of times these deals are handled in house. But if they get really complicated, then they'll kick them out to outside counsel, which is why me and my firm will get involved.
I think that that's really interesting because a lot of us see these different things at venues or, slapped on top of a race car, but we never really understand how they got there or how that deal was made. You hear official jewelry store of this, official drink of that, and I know I've heard it my whole entire life. This was an official cereal for so and so type person. And then the next thing you know, that cereal, you see all the athletes from specific places eating that kind of thing. So when all of that happens, how long does it take for a deal to go from concept to pretty much having legs on it and being an actual thing? How long is the process?
Wow, that's a really great question. So I would say it depends on the scope of the project. For smaller projects, and this is kind of a secret of the trade, there are oftentimes forms for sponsorship and vendor agreements. And so if you're doing kind of a 1 year deal for something very, very small, we probably could knock that out in a month or less, right? But something that is maybe, 5, 10 year, 30-year deal, that's going to require lots of kickers and lots of and negotiation on the back end, and maybe the rates are going to change over time. Well, that'll certainly be, a 6-month project, an 8-month project, depending on how motivated both sides are to get this thing done. But as I mentioned, these things don't just pop up, right? So the legal side really is the one that finalizes the thing, whereas the sales teams and the business teams really at the beginning of a project will conceive the idea and think about how to make it work before they even bring it to legal.
Good. So let me ask you this because I know we've seen a lot of conceptualized things kind of come out and then they fall flat because they're a little tone deaf considering the times. What can a brand or a team or a business do to kind of make sure that doesn't happen?
That's a great question. So the first thing we always like to advise clients of is to consider the audience. So before you jump out there with, a meme or a tweet or a t-shirt or an event, consider who this thing is going to be targeted at. And if that's not a customer with whom you are familiar, maybe you should get someone on your staff that is and ask them, hey, what do you think about this? How would this be perceived? Right? I think a lot of times we see some of these kind of brand deals or commercials going wrong. And the reason they go wrong is because they hit the wrong tone, but they're usually not devised with ill intent. So that's one thing that as a lawyer, I really try to stress to my friends and family is that a lot of times these business teams, these advertising teams are not acting with malicious intent. They just didn't know, right? And frankly, not knowing in this day and age is oftentimes as worse as bad as having that malicious intent. So we always advise first, just get to know your client really, really well, whoever the perceived target for this thing is. The second thing is to really make sure you run it by a lawyer who works in this area. So a lot of times we'll see people come on the other side and say, well, I ran it by my cousin who's a lawyer. Well, if that cousin is a criminal defense lawyer, they don't know all of the advertising and marketing laws or the FTC regulations on how you do sweepstakes on social media, right? They don't know what has to be in a gambling app, for instance. They don't know all the NIL rules just because they play college football, right? You have to get counsel that actually knows what they're doing, has a demonstrated knowledge in that area. And then the third thing would just be to step back and don't always go with the crowd. Really just be thoughtful about what you're doing. And a lot of times as a lawyer, we counsel clients to really slow down and consider whether the approach they're taking is the right one. Sometimes they listen to us, other times they don't, right? And that's their prerogative. But I think if you follow those 3 steps, you'll be in a really good position.
I like that you said that simply because it's something that I feel like we've seen a lot. A lot of businesses that kind of put something out there. There was a commercial for a soft drink a little while ago that they had a really nice person from reality TV in it, but the tone of it just fell flat. And I was thinking to myself, this is when you probably should have had somebody diversified your concept group of the people that you were running this by so you didn't have this happen. So the power of having a diversified group of people sit down and talk things over. Have you ever had to use your voice to kind of say, hey, this isn't going to be right?
We haven't had that issue on my side as far as an advertisement or kind of a marketing campaign, but we have seen it really within how we build our teams, right? Because everyone knows there's so much science out there about this that a diverse group is better than a homogeneous group as far as getting business results. What we've also seen though is that this is a small thing, but in our forms, right? A lot of the forms say, dear sir, or to whom it may concern, and it's addressed to a person that is supposed to be a man, but just like small things like that, really updating kind of how we talk about who is in business. Well, there are like lots of people who are not men, right, in business these days. And I think that's something that we should consider. You mentioned the soft drink issue, which of course we all know well. The one I was thinking about most recently, though, was a big retailer put together a big Juneteenth advertisement. And the people that were in the advertisement did not happen to be of Black descent. And it just was kind of this funny thing of, well, I'm not sure what the aim is here, right? Because it could be, well, everyone should celebrate it, and that's something we certainly would all love to see if everyone celebrated it like it should be celebrated. But on the other side, it's, well, you look like you didn't think about this at all, right? And that's what we try to counsel clients on is just think just a little bit, about how this is going to impact not only you, but your consumer.
When you said you want, it should be celebrated by everybody, right? But also, when you're planning this, should have been planned with everybody and especially your target market. That
Yep.
tickled me because on the outside looking in, we know you didn't have anybody there at the table when you were planning this. And there are things you could have done so that you could have gotten sales instead of a bunch of backlash.
The funny thing about how a lot of like retailers do their online marketing is that they have models come in and wear blank shirts, blank hats, blank pants or backpacks or whatever, and then they go in later and they add on logos on top of those. And so there are a few things from a lawyer standpoint that I'm thinking is that first, the model has no say on what is being put on their body and their faces out there for the world to see with this thing they don't agree with. And there actually is a really famous court case about the fact that once you signed your contract and you've been a model for this thing, you give your rights over, then whatever the owner of the work does with it really is up to them. You have no recourse, right? So that's the first thing I think about. And the second thing is, as a business, you just have to be more responsible and more judicious in how you're acting.
I think that I've seen some of those like hold up t-shirt ads where they actually use somebody else's hands, where they put like somebody famous's face behind it. I've seen, First Lady Obama. I've seen tons of people just holding up these shirts. And I'm like, anybody who's really looking can see that this person is not really there. Those aren't their hands. But I have also seen where, the model shows up, wears the plain black t-shirt, plain white t-shirt. And next thing you know, a slogan that they probably don't agree with is on there, but there's nothing you can do to avoid that other than just going over your contract with a fine-tooth comb. What do you think someone could possibly do? And I know this isn't your expertise, but what do you think someone could do to make sure that doesn't happen to them?
So it all depends on how much leverage you have, right? If you're a new model, you're usually going to give up all your rights to the photograph or the video or whatever the source material is when it's taken, unfortunately. But if you have a little bit more leverage, you can say, okay, well, you don't have a lifetime right to use this image, or this image should only be used for certain purposes, or I have the right to approve any further use beyond XYZ purpose. But again, that goes back to how much leverage you have and also having counsel with kind of the foresight to be able to tell you, hey, agree to this, but not that.
That makes a lot of sense when you say, look at this part and not that. And sometimes you'll get a company that is on some, no, it's the whole thing or nothing. And in that case, you kind of want to take the nothing. I know it seems like, oh no, I'm going to lose money, but
That's right. No, that's right. I've had people come to me, my corporate clients, but also kind of individual friends and family who say, I have this opportunity, but it has this big negative aspect to it. And they're always afraid of losing the opportunity. Well, I'm telling them, well, don't you want to lose it if it has this negative thing that you can't live with? And they don't want to negotiate. But I'm saying you have to negotiate, because if you don't, you're going to be in a bad situation and you're going to resent this contract the entire time you're in it.
that's good. And I always, because I am of a certain age, I always remember Vanessa Williams becoming Miss America. And then some she did a long time ago coming back to haunt her. And then she got stripped of everything. So I've always kind of lived my life, even when I was younger and foolish, to where if I was going to do something, I tried to do it in such a way that it wouldn't come back to haunt me later, or I just did not do it. And I think that that's the same when you get into, any type of branding and deals of that nature, because one day you never know, one of us could be the owner of a super huge company and we need to start making some deals. But if you've done something, I think that it could be detrimental to your business. Have you seen where that can become a really big problem for a company, where people don't want to work with you because you've done something?
That hasn't come up in my work at all, really, because I'm really on the side of business is trying to get this thing done. And usually in transactional law, we say that both sides are motivated to get the deal done, which is different than being a litigator or kind of an investigator where there's somebody at fault. So in my work, what I've seen a lot of is people really motivated to get it done. By the time they get to kind of our drawing table, they know all the flaws of the counterparty and they're ready just to rock and roll, and they want to navigate those waters, but they're ready to go.
I get it. So you deal with, like you said, a lot of transactional law, a lot of money and big deals. exchanging hands. Have you come across a business, and we're not going to name anybody, that's super big, but they needed like a loan, or especially, after the pandemic and like during those times when consumerism was at an all time low? How do businesses handle loan processes? Are they much different from regular everyday people?
Not different at all. And so to your question of have I seen businesses that need a loan? I will say that probably 90% of the companies in this country operate with financing. You hear this thing all the time, like on the personal side, like debt is bad, getting personal loans is bad, using credit cards is bad. So many companies are operating with financing, which is why, if you remember a few months ago, the Silicon Valley Bank issue was such a big issue where people, and the bank was actually in good condition if you look at their actual records, but there was a run on the bank because of some tweets, which, obviously, right? But to go back to the question, a lot of companies in all industries use financing for certain projects. Some use it to make payroll, some use it to do acquisitions. And what we do on my side, as far as counsel for the lender, is we make sure that the companies are in good condition and that they can afford to pay the loan back, right? So it's a similar process to where if a person had a mortgage, the mortgage lender would say, okay, I'm happy to give you this mortgage at this interest rate, but we have some conditions, right? We got to pay it back within these many years. You got to pay it back on this day of the month. You have to make sure, you don't have another mortgage come across for the same property, right? There are conditions. Think about that same thing, but put it in a business context. There are just a few more conditions. There are a few more restrictions on what the company can do. And there's a lot more diligence done because the numbers just get bigger. When I tell people about kind of the work that I do, I ask them to think about kind of their own process and say they had a small business, right? That they wanted to, say, merge with the business down the street, but they needed financing for it. Well, who are you going to call? A big bank. What are they going to say? Happy to help you, but let's make sure that the business you're buying is reputable and in good standing. And let's make sure that you have operators in your business who are diligent, thorough, honest, and are willing to and able to pay this loan back over time.
I don't think I thoroughly understood what happened in Silicon Valley until you just said it. Because I'm like, why is everybody freaking out? It's a bank. Well, if that's where all of your stuff is and where it's coming from, of course that's going to be a very big issue when you're a business. So because you're in, and I'm going to ask you this on more of a small business level, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be a big business, like when their business grows up? What advice would you give to them on the ground level in order to grow up and make sure they've got good solid bones and good solid structure?
That's a fantastic question. So the first thing I tell anybody who is in a sole proprietorship or small business is to make sure your record keeping is very, very clean. This is one of the big issues we saw back during COVID with people not getting a chance to take those PPP loans because you had to have financial records from the previous tax year. And if you did not have those, then you could not take advantage of the money that the government was giving really risk free to a business. And so having really good records early on, even if it's only, two employees. The next thing I would say is that you should have a good accountant and a good lawyer. Of course, when you're smaller, lawyers are expensive, accountants are expensive, but you have to kind of invest in yourself early once you start making that money just to make sure that you're protected. And the third thing I would say is get to know others in the business community. I think a lot of times small businesses try to go at it alone, but there are so many small business lawyers and small business bankers who are out in the community trying to get to know people, trying to give away money, trying to help businesses flourish, especially in this economy. And if you're a small business owner that's so consumed with just what you're doing, then you're not at all going to be able to take advantage of that. Right. So if you don't know anybody locally that knows about the small business administration, then you need to like look up the lawyers around you, the bankers around you in your area and get to know those people because the SBA is really what drives a lot of the small and medium sized businesses in this country.
I like the ideas that you've given, because everybody thinks that, oh, yeah, I'll just have a business. No, you got to make sure your records are good. And I think
Yep.
that's why a lot of people got in trouble with the PPP loans. You got to make sure your records are good. And you
Yep.
have to, I don't care how big, how small, got to make sure you have a good accountant and you at least have a lawyer that you can go to for help.
That's right.
I
That's right.
like that.
And the issue with the PPP stuff, the biggest news pieces we saw on it was, well, there's so much out there, so much money out there, and people aren't taking advantage of it. That's the first thing we saw. Then the second thing we saw was, well, there's people out there getting it, but then it's been fraudulent. Well, the fraud piece is people who had like malicious intent from the get go. right?
Right.
And there's no way really to detect that from the government side, right? And the government's trying to do a good thing for people. We're in a
Mhm.
pandemic. We've never seen this before. How do we help, right? And they're giving a lot of that money back. I mean, we've seen all the court cases. They're really finding people that were using it to buy, jewelry and cars and clothes, and they're really going to get their money back, which I appreciate. But then we also saw people that taking it but did not need. And that's something that I think you can make your own judgment for whether that was right or wrong. But one thing I would tell the small business or medium-sized business owner is don't hate the player, hate the game. Unless you're ready to take advantage of all opportunities, then you can't be upset when somebody else does.
Absolutely. So, for another lawyer or somebody who is aspiring into law and they think that they want to kind of do what you do, what would you tell an up and coming student in college who thinks they want to do what you do? What advice would you give them?
So I'll start with a law student or a college student that wants to go to law school. The first thing I would say is really consider where you go to school and how much it's going to cost you and who's paying for it. Unfortunately, the best way to get a job, a high paying job out of law school is to go to a top firm kind of regionally or nationally. And if nobody's told you this, because no one told me this before I went to law school, the law school rankings
Mhm.
matter more than college rankings do. Right. So a lot of these law firms really only going to recruit from the top 20 or so law schools. I've seen firms that only recruit from the top 10 law schools, and they only want the top third of the students in the top 10 law schools. And so I think people consider law to be this huge thing where you can like get into it and make a lot of money. But
Yeah.
as a tangent, I'll say lawyers have this bimodal salary function, right? Where there's a lot of lawyers making a lot and a lot of lawyers making essentially minimum wage and they've spent 3 years and a lot of money, a lot of time, and they are making 15 bucks an hour, essentially. You can look it up. That's a real thing. That's a real thing. So, but I would never discourage anybody who wants to go to law school because I think, especially for minorities, first gen, it is a great way to get in the business community, but also kind of level up your family's wealth. I would never discourage anybody from doing it. But the first thing I would say is a college student, really consider where you're going to law school. And I would say if it's not top 20, probably shouldn't go. Just gonna be 100% honest. And that's not because I don't think the law degree isn't valuable at other places. It is valuable. But if you got to pay for it, then it becomes less valuable unless you have a job lined up already for yourself. So that's not me being like hoity toity or anything like that about the top 20. I just think that your investment is going to pay off better if you can kind of guarantee yourself a spot in those schools. Once you're in law school, the job there is really to focus on getting the best grades you can, but also to meet as many employers as you can. I think people, especially people that are black and brown, kind of have been taught just keep your head down, do your work, get the best grades you can, and then it'll happen for you. That is not at all how the law works. The law works really by kind of getting the best grades you can, but also by letting people know that you're out there and available to be recruited. So a lot of law schools do this where in the first semester you're meeting law firms, you're meeting lawyers. Don't sit back on your heels. You need to get in there and meet those people and follow up and follow up and follow up. People will sit back until the third year to meet lawyers on the outside, and that's much too late. You've not ruined your career, you've not ruined your life at all, but it's much better if you can start early, kind of building those connections, right? Because you never know where you're going to end up or where other people will end up. So, first is go to a good school. The second is once you're in school, really take advantage of all opportunities from an early start. And I guess 2A would be, or 2B would be don't get so down if your first semester grades aren't great. Just keep at it. And while you're doing this thing about getting your grades better, you have to also remember to keep networking externally. So that's number two. And then number three would be once you are looking for jobs, really consider what those jobs will be like. We mentioned it at the beginning, but a lot of people think law is going to be like Olivia Pope or, or Suits or whatever or Johnny Cochran. And I can't tell people how that's the furthest thing from the truth, from the actual day-to-day work of law. I heard something the other day about how over 60% of lawyers are actually introverts. And so if you're an extrovert, then you really got to consider what kind of career path, what kind of firm, what kind of practice area you want to go down as a lawyer. It's kind of crazy. And so I would just really consider the practice area and how you're going to make your investment pay off. As far as the money thing, law school has gotten exponentially more expensive even since I went. But if you look at now versus 20 years ago, it's almost unaffordable. So I think that's why you're seeing people really pause and consider whether or not law school is worth it. I'll say that if you can kind of follow the rules I've set out, it is worth it. But if you're going to have to pay a lot of money and you're not going to a school where they can kind of guarantee you a job, I think you need to really take a second look at that and think about whether this is for you or not.
That's very helpful information for someone who's coming up because, yes, we all do think that law school is just like How to Get Away with Murder. We all think that that's what you do. And nobody really
Exactly
is
right.
preparing anyone for how much it costs and everything else that goes into it. And a lot of people do think that you can sit around your 1L year and just kind of like chill and float. No, you really have to hit the ground running and networking from day one. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said you got to be prepared. And we're not just
Yep.
putting our head down and keeping to the grind like you would in another profession. This one, you got to literally come out swinging.
That's right. And part of the grade thing is because law school doesn't teach you how to be a lawyer. And everyone says this. And so like, what does that mean? Well, in law school, you're learning kind of what we call black letter law, what the law says. But when you're practicing law, you're actually doing the work of implementing the law in your day-to-day life. And you don't do a whole lot of that implementation during law school at all.
And hopefully, with everything we've talked about here, will help somebody break into law school. I want to thank you, CJ, for being our guest today. I greatly appreciated it, and I learned some new information along the way. Thank you.